Hallo and willkommen. This is Zeitgeist, the most German blog and podcast available in the English language. And I'm Katja Heuer, historian, journalist, and all-purpose Anglo-German. If you've listened to this podcast before, you will know that I always have one guest on to speak to me about their work and life in connection to German history, politics, and culture. Sometimes we even mention the war. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. If perhaps in a slightly more serious manner than you're used from me, because I'm delighted to have John Nichol here with me today. John served in the Royal Air Force for 15 years on active duty during the First Gulf War in 1991. His Tornado bomber was shot down during a mission over Iraq. Captured, tortured, and held as prisoner of war, John was paraded on television, provoking worldwide condemnation and leaving one of the most enduring images of that conflict. Today, John is the best-selling co-author of Tornado Down and the author of many other highly acclaimed epics, such as Spitfire, Lancaster, and Tornado, all of which were Sunday Times bestsellers. He's also made a number of TV documentaries for Second World War veterans, written for national newspapers and magazines, and he's a widely quoted and acclaimed commentator on military affairs. And his latest book, The Unknown Warrior, is coming out in September. There will also be a spectacular book tour to go with it, and you are, of course, amongst the first people to hear from John right here at Zeitgeist. Welcome.
Guten Tag, danke schön. Katja, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. That was sehr gut.
Sehr gut.
You're German, excellent. Perfect introduction. That's what we like here. A bit of German chucked in. Before we get to the subject of your latest book, The Unknown Warrior, let's talk a little bit about you. I mean, you don't need much of an introduction for our British listeners, since you've become such a well-known voice and face over here. But for all of the other Zeitgeisters out there, I think it's well worth delving into your fascinating and sort of somewhat difficult biography a bit. So let's maybe start with the beginning. So you seem to have wanted to join the Royal Air Force, the RAF, from a very young age, and you worked extremely hard to make that dream come true. Can you tell us a little bit about why this was so important to you, even as a young boy, and what difficulties you faced along the way?
Yeah, I mean, we go back for that story to 1979, Katja. I was.
We like going back here.
I know. I was growing up in the northeast of England. I was lucky enough to go to a grammar school. And I think I was probably expected to be the first in the family to do A-levels and go to university, but I wanted to get out and about, and I wanted to start a career. And the military then, for young kids like me, offered a great way of training, getting a career, getting a trade. So I joined the Royal Air Force I applied when I was 15, but I joined when I was just 16, just after finishing school. And I did 5 years as a technician. So electronics technician, radios, communications, secure communications. Served around the world, did a lot of time in Germany. So we're going back to kind of 1981 to 1986, spent a lot of time on the North German plain, under canvas, in trenches, because I was in tactical communications. And then after a few years, I applied for a commission to be an officer and I wanted to be a pilot, but I didn't make the grade for that. So I started tornado training. And kind of, I think 1986, I got commissioned, started my tornado training in 1987, and ended up at the Tri-National Tornado Training Establishment in Cottesmore in Leicestershire, where my student pilot that I flew with was a German Luftwaffe pilot. Thomas.
I didn't expect there to be this much Germanness in your story. Excellent.
We can do Germany all the way.
I read somewhere that your training, apart from all the technical stuff, also included sort of learning, officer etiquette. Can you tell us a bit about that? What did that entail?
I mean, so as a young officer, doing my officer training in 1986, we had lectures called Officer Qualities, and it was quite old-fashioned. It's not that long ago, but in cultural terms, it's light years ago. So Certainly, I remember somebody telling me an officer never wears jeans, not even to do the gardening. Because I had a bit of experience in the military. I arrived kind of a little bit, I don't know, flash with my kind of purple tasseled shoes and kind of things like that. And I was soon informed that they were not really kind of the type of thing. Now, to be fair, this was just at the very initial stages. Once you got out of that very first training environment, nobody really bothered much about that kind of thing anyway. But no, there was, certainly, you had practice dinners. You learned which way, I don't know, kind of 5 or 6 knives and forks on either side. It sounds, but there was a purpose to it, because there's tradition and there's a way of doing things. And if you go to a formal dinner in a military establishment, especially in an officer's mess, they're quite grand. And they can be really spectacular. And so it was more about making sure that you didn't feel uncomfortable rather than saying, you're a bit thick, this is how you use a knife and fork.
And once you'd kind of learned how to sort your forks and sort of put the right suit on, you became a navigator. And then I read that you were stationed at RAF Labruch in Germany. When was that, and what was that like?
So I finished my tornado training. I got to Labruch in 1989. The summer of 1989. I loved it.
Oh wow! Just at the end of the Cold War, then you were there.
It was really interesting, Katja, because obviously I'd been involved in the Cold War since I joined in 1981, and all of the training at that point in the military was all about preparations for the Cold War. Mm-hmm. So it was all about being able to hold back the Soviet troops, the East German troops, the Soviet bloc troops, long enough until the Americans could get over the pond, to.
Yeah, I mean, they're often a little bit late, aren't they? That's
but there was hundreds of thousands of us. I can't remember how many of us were based in Germany then, but there was 100,000 people in the Royal Air Force. I think it's about 22,000 now. There must have been kind of 300,000 or 400,000 American troops based in Germany as well. And even in 1989, we were still, so the Cold War was getting warmer, but it wasn't over when I got there. So I was flying the Tornado in Germany as a navigator. It was still primarily a nuclear strike aircraft. So we were still training, I think I can probably tell you this now, on an almost daily basis for nuclear strikes, limited nuclear strikes to hold back any Warsaw Pact advance. And the East German border was still there. I mean, it was still there.
I was on the other side.
Well, I know you were. But your just tell me where you live. I may well have been going to drop something on you, But listen, it's crackers when you think about it now.
It is. It really is.
In the aftermath, I went on to kind of meet former East German flyers, former Soviet flyers, who we were going to kill each other only a few years before. But the Iron Curtain in Berlin, obviously, but down between East and West Germany was all of that. I should have got an old map out. It's marked on our maps. So there's the Iron Curtain, the East-West Germany, but there's a buffer zone, and you could fly close to it. But if you started getting towards that buffer zone, you could cause some real trouble. And so the Cold War was still a Cold War then, but obviously, it kind of quite quickly turned warm just at the same time in 1990, which is when it all more or less happened, as Iraq invaded Kuwait.
Yeah,
and the world changed forever.
Amazing how all these things sometimes happen together. With these kind of really big, tactical and potentially very, dangerous situations in mind, did you still have a sense of sort of where you were, that you were in Germany, or did you live in a kind of enclosed world, as Americans often do, I think?
No, not for me, no. So absolutely not. I lived, because Labruch is on the Dutch-German border. I lived in Holland for a year and lived in Germany the year after, had a flat in Germany, but we socialized a huge amount in both Holland and Germany. It was fantastic, so some of the big things that I just remember. So the Rhine in Flammen. I hope that sorry, my accent's going to be terrible now, but that was I can still remember somebody saying, let's go to this festival, the Rhine in Flames.
Isn't this like the thing with the fireworks and
yeah, well, it's first of all, they set the Rhine on fire. It's basically huge, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of floating kind of burning containers. And it was one of the most astonishing experiences of my life. I loved it. And then there's massive fireworks. Oktoberfest obviously was a huge thing in the calendar. We used to go skiing down into southern Germany in I can't remember what the place is called now, where we used to go skiing in southern Germany. So I loved it. I loved living in Europe, and we used to go all over Germany, all over Holland. The Belgian Grand Prix. You could drive to the Belgian Grand Prix in kind of 2 or 3 hours. So no, I loved my time in Germany. Really loved it. It was a great experience.
And then shortly after that, you had a sort of far more, serious experience for yourself when you were deployed in the Gulf War in 1991. And that was when you were shot down and captured by Iraqi forces. Can you tell us first of all what happened?
Yeah. So as Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, and the world, people have forgotten this now, but the world came together to say to Iraq, you must leave Kuwait, and if you do not leave Kuwait, we will evict you. And by the end of that year, I think there was about 1 million of us, something like that, troops from all over the world, predominantly American, massive 50,000 Brits, but there was everybody there, German, Italian, Saudi, Kuwaiti, from all over the world were there. And obviously the war started in January 1991. My war lasted very, very little. I was shot down on the first day, captured. A lot of your listeners might remember myself and my pilot, John Peters, being paraded on TV. Pictures were flashed around the world. And that was my kind of war over. My friends flew and fought for the next 7 weeks. Luckily, fortunately, the losses were not as great as we were expecting. That does not take away from anybody who was injured, who did lose their life, because it was catastrophic. But after 7 weeks, Iraq was evicted from Kuwait, and we headed off. We were released, handed back. There was, I think, probably 30 prisoners of war, British, American, Saudi, Kuwaiti, Italian. And, so that 7-week conflict was an eye-opener because it put the Western technology on display. It put the Western military might on display. You might remember, you probably don't remember, but it was the first kind of images where we saw laser-guided bombs going through windows and down chimneys. We saw cruise missiles flying down high streets. Nobody had ever really seen this before. And the display of Western military might was astonishing. But there's a downside to it, because what happened was politicians looked at this Western military might and thought, we can use that again. And the world has been in turmoil ever since 1991. My Gulf War, 1991, was the last really successful military operation. In that, the orders were to evict Iraq from Kuwait, which is what happened. Anything else after that was political. But the world and that region, we know that today, is still in turmoil because of what happened in the aftermath. So Western military might isn't as good, perhaps, at solving every problem.
Yeah, but as your own experience shows, that didn't happen without a huge price to be paid in individual kind of experiences as well. On the face of it, it looked as though you'd coped remarkably well with your own harrowing experience, in the sense that you you came out of it the other end. You stayed in the RAF. You didn't kind of, borrow down and kind of got sort of I don't know, had your life determined by this, but you got over that. But I've also read in some interviews and pieces that you wrote that it's still something that affects you, and you still find it difficult to look at these images today. So how do you deal with this today? Is it still something that affects you over 3 decades later?
It affects me in a few different ways, to be honest, Katja. So first of all, you kind of alluded to, in your question, you said, how do you cope? How do you get it? Well, I think in many ways, in the midst of that horror, and it was pretty horrific. We were brutalized, we were beaten, we were burnt. We nearly died on a number of occasions. They nearly killed us on a couple of occasions. So it was pretty horrific. But you don't cope with that. You simply exist. There's nothing brave in somebody beating you, nothing brave in somebody putting a gun against your head and pulling the trigger. You don't cope with that. You just exist. And in the aftermath, men are particularly bad at this. Military men are very bad. Military men from the northeast of England are really terrible at talking about their feelings and everything else. But the simple fact was, I was certainly affected by my experiences. I didn't really understand it till maybe 5 years after. Simple things. So loud noises, fireworks going off make me jump out of my skin still. 2 weeks ago, last week, we had a village party, big firework display, and I'm cowering under a table. There's one of the greatest things about post-traumatic stress disorder is a hyper-awareness of perceived danger. So, and I talked to a psychiatrist about this. He said, you see danger wherever you go. He said, you live your life in long grass. Which is actually probably quite true. You said you live your life in long grass and you are constantly looking around you, imagining where danger will come from. Now, part of that's what you do in the military.
I was going to say that's probably hard to disentangle from your training.
But living in the military, which is living in the military, preparing for conflict is about preparing for when things go wrong. You're highly trained. You know how to fire a rifle. You know how to fly a jet. You know how to drop a bomb. But you're constantly preparing for the time something goes wrong. And you have to do something different. And so when you mix that with post-traumatic stress disorder and the long grass, he made me understand why it was I was like that sometimes, why it was I could be a pain in the backside sometimes. That's the reality. And so, an injury of the mind can be as damaging as somebody losing an arm. But you can see that somebody's lost an arm, but you can't see an injury of the mind. And perhaps, we may or may not get onto it later on, but obviously, the First World War kind of illustrated that perhaps more than anything in actual fact.
Absolutely, and we will get on to that now. I mean, you do poke your head a lot above the long grass, if you will, quite a lot actually, in terms of you having come out with this experience, written a book about it, talking about it. Today, you're also an incredibly successful speaker and broadcaster, consultant and author. So in a way, it's also, I suppose, a way of dealing with these things. You've been writing particularly about air warfare, iconic British planes such as the Spitfire and the Lancaster. But as you've just alluded, your new book, The Unknown Warrior, A Personal Journey of Discovery and Remembrance, is actually about the First World War, which is a conflict where ground forces were key and air warfare was still in its infancy. So what inspired you to write this?
So all of my previous books, so Unknown Warrior is my 19th book. Which, if you think about it, when I was in a cell in Baghdad 33 years ago, is pretty astonishing to think about. And I've always written about at least something with an aviation theme. But I was in Westminster Abbey in London with one of our World War II veterans, a Bomber Command veteran. And he was telling me about the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior. We were looking at it. I've seen it lots of times. I had not really understood what it was. I knew that it was the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior and it represented, I didn't know what it represented. And he was telling me about it. And I thought, I don't know anything about this. And that's what sparked my journey to discover more. And the kind of thing that really kind of kicked it off was talking about the casualties of the First World War, which are well known, the hideous losses on the Somme on both sides, the hideous losses at Ypres and Passchendaele on both sides. But one of the things that stood out for me, and I don't know if there are similar German figures, but so there was just over 1 million British Empire soldiers killed during the First World War. And now, just over 100 years later, 500,000 still have no known grave. Now, I found that astonishing. I've been to the great cemeteries in Belgium and in France and looked, and we see the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands of named graves, or unnamed, where it says a soldier of the Great War known unto God. I hadn't realized how and why so many were either unknown or had no resting place and were commemorated on the great memorials, perhaps the Thiepval, the Meningate. And so that really sparked my journey, and I started to research it. I went back to the battlefields. I went back to the Somme, walked some of the battlefields to try to understand it. Clearly, one of the things that I've always done with my books is interview living people to talk about it. So whether that was, so I interviewed for Lancaster, the Lancaster bomber, something, of course, your listeners will be very familiar with. I interviewed, obviously, Lancaster bomber veterans, but I interviewed German civilians. I interviewed German civilians who had been under the bombs of the Lancaster bombers or the bombs of Bomber Command to get their stories, to understand how warfare affects people. It's always been important for me to try to tell. I don't even like using words both sides of the story, but that people are affected, and it's normal people, whether you are in the Luftwaffe and trying to shoot down a Lancaster, and I spoke to a couple of Luftwaffe fighter pilots who killed Lancaster veterans, Lancaster aircrew, and spoke to Lancaster aircrew about dropping bombs on German civilians and dropping bombs on German military bases. For me, it's really important to understand that.
I think that really comes across in your book as well, because you do take, all sides and everyone involved incredibly seriously. That statistic that you just mentioned, that was something that really struck me about your book as well, because it's not something that, because the numbers are so big, it's not something that is easy to take in. When we're talking about 1 million British Empire soldiers being killed and 500,000 still have no known grave. I mean, that's a massive figure. Why is that? Did you come to a conclusion in your book in the end?
So again, I'm not sure, but I don't really know about the German statistics. I don't think they perhaps did the same. They had the same methodology of recording the dead and the burials, etc., because I think that at the time it wasn't possible in the way that we do. But so there was two things that happened. So people who had no known grave. So they were lost. They were lost forever. And there was a number of ways how bodies could be lost forever. Clearly, one of the biggest one was the artillery barrages on both sides. So I've got a number of accounts of people experiencing artillery barrages where somebody ceased to be. So they would say, sometimes they'd say there was a foot in a boot and we thought it was the captain. Or somebody would say, they were all standing there and then they weren't there anymore. And we don't know who was killed and we don't know where they went. They were just lost. So that was one way. They could be lost in the mud of the battlefields. So killed during a mass attack, lost to the mud. And we still have, even just recently, we are still finding bodies coming out of the fields around France and Belgium where bodies are starting to be unearthed. So that was another way they could be lost. One of the ones that I was really surprised at, and in many ways is quite horrific, is that people were buried. But in general terms, people were buried. It's quite difficult to record where the graves were. Sometimes they were buried in the midst of battle in a shell scrape or a big shell hole, 40 men thrown into a shell hole. Somebody might record the names, and I've got a specific account of this, recorded the names and the locations, then that person was killed 20 minutes later, and all the information was lost. And again, one of the worst things was that people were buried, people were recorded. There might even be temporary grave markers there. Could be anything from a rifle and a helmet or a name scratched on a post. But because of the flowing battle lines, they were blasted out of their graves during artillery barrages. And so dead bodies were blasted out blown apart and scattered far and wide.
It's a
And so
horrific thought, isn't it? And
it's beyond comprehension. And that is why so many people were rendered unknown, rendered non-existent. The means that somebody could become a non-person were extreme. And we know that because 500,000 of them were.
Mm. And I think it's also, I gathered this from sort of reading your book, something that the soldiers themselves at the time were extremely conscious of. So the idea that not just that you weren't identified as a dead body if you get killed, but also that you were just forgotten somewhere in a foreign field, quite literally. Did you come across any sort of personal stories or sources that sort of speak to this?
Yeah, and, you know, it's so you kindly read the book for me a few months ago, and I really appreciated that. And
so did I, John. It's a great read.
Well, as you've seen, your quote is all over the internet at the minute. I'll give you the 10 euros. I'll send that in the post.
Thank you.
The notion of somebody being lost was really quite extreme at the time, because people knew that people were being lost and never discovered. So a number of things were happening. So first of all, when the bodies were being buried, the people doing the burying tried their hardest to make sure that they could identify them and record it. One said, you know, one of the accounts that I've got talked about, this is quite extreme, but there was a dead body that had been dead a while. You know, some lay out in the battlefield for sometimes a year or 2 years as the battles moved back and forwards. And one chap talks about picking up bodies on a shovel, and it's just a mass of rotting flesh and maggots. And he talks about having to dig into the massive flesh and maggots to try to find an identity tag or an identity bracelet. And he said, we never wanted to bury anybody unknown. That was the worst thing that could happen. But clearly they did. Identifying people was quite difficult. You know, people talk about, so first of all, they might have one identity disc. Not everybody did, but at the beginning they might have one identity disc. Well, if you're buried with your identity disc, sorry, if the identity disc was taken off you to be handed back to headquarters to say, I buried this man, and then the body was blown out of the grave, or the grave was lost, you've lost. It doesn't matter that you know that the person's died and you buried him. He's gone. And people bought their own identity bracelets, and they put some on one on either arm, so that at least there was some hope. People, as time went on, we were sending out hundreds of thousands of crosses with tar on the base, so they could be hammered into the ground, and people registered, and the cross didn't rot, because the early crosses were bits of wood that rotted after a year or 2 years. And so the means of trying to identify these people went on. And as you know, Katya, one of the things that I tried to do with the book, because there were no living people, I interviewed relatives of those who had done it. I tried to bring the story up to date, and you'll remember that there's a story in the book from the Falkland Islands. So one of the people, that story I tell, is a padre called David Relton, who actually became the man who instigated the whole idea of the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior. But I interviewed another padre, a living padre, who'd served in the Falklands conflict in 1982. And I hadn't thought about this, but he was burying unidentified Argentine soldiers because they didn't carry identification the way that we did. So he buried, I think at one point, 13 or 14 bodies that he did not know who they were. And he just had to record the position and if they had any different insignia on them or anything like that. And that's that's not that long ago that we had unknown warriors. Now, many of them have been identified subsequently because of DNA. But at the time, for many years, I think possibly 10 years, 15 years, because of the ongoing hostilities, conflict between Great Britain and Argentina, they couldn't be disinterred and identified and returned. And there are still a few unidentified Argentine soldiers. And so that concept of not knowing, of the thought of being buried unknown, well, I've always said that the dead don't care. And I'm still a firm believer in that. The dead are dead. They simply do not care. But the living care. The living care about what's happened to the others. And that's still important. And in the book, I speak to two ladies, one who lost a father in the Falklands conflict, whose body was lost as his ship went down. So she has nothing. All his possessions went. She has nothing, no grave, no possessions, no resting place. And I spoke to a lady who's a friend of mine whose husband was killed in a tornado crash at the beginning of the training for the Gulf War in 1990. He was lost at sea in a tornado crash, and his body was never recovered. She has nothing. And that's quite recent. That's in recent times.
And it is an experience, as you say, that does really bother people. There's no closure. There's nowhere to go, nowhere to commemorate them. And I suppose the Unknown Warrior Memorial that you talked about at the beginning is an attempt, in a way, as a society, as a country, as a nation, to find a way of dealing with that, commemorating the ones that died but have nowhere. Can you tell us a little bit about the idea behind that memorial and how it came about?
Yeah. So 1920, the war had been over. 1918, 1904, I think just over a year. There'd been the first Armistice Day, and it wasn't a victory parade. I think it was a remembrance parade in 1919. And then the government was getting ready for the second anniversary of the armistice on the 11th of November 1920, and the cenotaph. So the cenotaph that we have in London now, a grand war memorial on Whitehall, there'd been a temporary one, and now the beautiful one that's there had been built and was going to be unveiled. And Padre David Relton, his story is in the book extensively, who'd buried so many of the dead, who'd written letters to the loved ones of the dead, the loved ones of the dead said, "Oh, Padre, please tell me where he is. Please tell me where you buried him. Tell me any information." So in that run-up in 1920, there was still hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who didn't really know about their loved ones. They knew they were missing, presumed dead, but they knew nothing. And it was Padre David Relton's idea to come up with this tomb of an unknown warrior, the unknown warrior, in London, in Westminster Abbey, which is the grand church in London, to represent all those missings, to offer comfort to the bereaved. And it did. It took off and it happened really quickly. And I mean, in a matter of months stroke weeks, the scheme took off. The concept of how it would happen, the selection process, and then the planning for the grand parade, the bringing home of a body and the planning of a grand parade happened very, very quickly. And you've read some of the quotes, but the one that sticks out for me was the concept that it could be anybody. Nobody knows who that is. There's been some talk about who it might be, the type of person it might be, the branch of the military it could be. But in reality, nobody knows who is there. And there was one, I think a little boy wrote a letter trying to get a ticket for the ceremony. And his words were, "The man in that coffin might be my daddy." Mm. And that's it. That's the story of the unknown warrior. He could be anybody, he could be nobody, he could be everybody. He could be anybody's uncle, anybody's father, anybody's husband. And that's the story. And that's why it came about. And that's why it was so successful. That's why hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people turned out on the streets to see the cenotaph unveiled and to witness the ceremony and the parade as the body of the unknown warrior, which had been brought back from northern France, was paraded through the streets of London.
Yeah, and that I mean, you describe that in the book in such a fascinating way. Even the conflict between, it was absolutely important that nobody found out who that person was, even if they had been able to, because then suddenly you know it's not your father or your husband or whatever. It's the whole point is that it's an unknown warrior, an unknown person that anybody can imagine or envision to sort of stand in for their relatives. What were you able to find out though when you retraced his journey a little bit? Was there something that particularly stuck with you about maybe the way that they went about this, or anything else that you found out?
Yeah, very much so. When you read the grave, it says here lies the body of an unknown warrior brought from France. I can't remember the exact quote, to represent all the missing. Then you think, my God, there's actually a body there, and I didn't know that. I kind of thought, is it a memorial? But no, there's a body there. And what they did was, and again, Accounts vary, but I've taken as my primary source the account of the man who did it, General Lewis Wyatt, who ordered it happen and ordered the scheme. So they went out to the great battlefields of World War I in early November 1920, and 4 teams were ordered to bring back the remains of one of the graves that said an unknown British soldier or an unknown British serviceman, because it could be naval, because there was the naval division served there in the early days, and it could be Air Force, of course, because a number of Air Force people were shot down, or as it was then the Royal Flying Corps, as it was at the beginning, was shot down. So it could be any of the branches. But so it was they picked 4 bodies, and the orders were to pick somebody who was long dead, and there was basically remains. Now, so that's quite interesting, isn't it? What does that mean? So I then went to speak to a lady who disinterred the dead. She'd been involved in the Kosovo and other conflicts, disinterred the dead to identify them and to help closure in more recent conflicts. And I talked to her about disinterring the dead. What's it like? You know, what does it smell like? What does it feel like? But if you think about it, that's what they were doing. That's what these 4 teams were doing. They were digging, and they weren't coffins then. They were digging into the earth to find until they got to the remains of somebody beneath a cross that said an unknown British soldier. So I talked to her about what the mechanics were of getting a long dead body out of the ground were astonishing. I mean, really astonishing. As you know, we're probably a bit too graphic to go into here, but
I found it fascinating. But yeah,
she said that. I mean, one of the things that she said, that if somebody is long dead, but they've been buried in their clothes, in their uniform, whatever, when you pick them up, the body tends to stay together, but the extremities fall off, which means the head, the hands, and the feet, because it's rotting, and so then you have to gather that back up to put it all together.
And do it all in a dignified way, given that
it's a dignified person. And they did it in a dignified way then. And so they got the remains of 4 soldiers that were then taken to St. Paul in northern France, to the headquarters of General Wyatt. And at around midnight, he went into the temporary chapel. The remains were on 4 stretchers covered by Union Jacks, and he just simply selected one. Now, some reports have him being blindfolded, some reports have him kind of, but in his account, and it's very short, he says, I went into the chapel, the 4 bodies were on 4 stretchers covered by Union Jacks, and I selected one. And we placed it in a coffin. And that's all, that's it. That's all we know for sure. So it went into a temporary pine coffin that had been sent out from the UK to hold the remains. And then that coffin was taken to Boulogne, to the castle in Boulogne on the French coast, where a grand coffin awaited it that had been designed and built in the UK. A beautiful, if you look at the pictures that you've seen, a beautiful coffin. And the pine coffin was put in that, and that was then the unknown warrior's coffin. And then his grand parade started from Boulogne harbour to be taken across the channel, to arrive in Dover, to be carried by carriage through the darkened night on the 10th of November, to arrive in Victoria Station at platform 8. And if you go to Victoria Station now, there is a plaque that said, "Here arrived the unknown warrior on the night of the 10th of November 1920. It's the plaque still there. And there's a ceremony every year.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's one of those things people just walk past.
And then on the 11th of November, the body was taken, paraded through the streets in a grand parade to the cenotaph, for the unveiling of the cenotaph, where the king awaited and put his own wreath. And then after the unveiling of the cenotaph, the body was paraded to Westminster Abbey, followed by the king and the royal family and all of the most senior members of the military, to be buried in quite a quick service in Westminster Abbey. So from planning to being interred happened really, really quickly.
Mm.
And the point is, nobody knows. Lots of people say, oh, it could be this, it could be that. Nobody knows who is in that grave. Now, I was I went to see the current Dean of Westminster. So the Dean Ryle, who was the Dean in 1920, was responsible for the church aspects and the ceremonial aspects. But I went to see the current Dean of Westminster, Dean Hoyle, who gave me quite a bit of time, and we chatted. And his father, I think his grandfather and uncle had served in the First World War. Which is so we are chatting about it was just the links were astonishing. But he said he had heard that there had been proposals to open the grave of the tomb of the unknown warrior and DNA test it to discover. And he said, but that's the whole point is not to know
completely
what purpose. Now, I mean, I would say it would be deeply offensive, but maybe others disagree. But what would be served by that?
Yeah, quite the opposite. I mean, it would destroy the whole point of it.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that there is, as you say, and as many of the people that you spoke to for the book said, that is a story that resonates and the concept that resonates to today, because ultimately we haven't solved the problem entirely. We've got a lot better at it, but people are still lost in conflict, and that still gives comfort to those who need it. I mean, one of the things that I found really quite fascinating and different and original about your book is just how personal it is. Really, kind of, you walk around, you talk to people, you really get into those conversations and into finding out, you know, how the body came to be there. So, you know, it's very obvious that this is, as the title of your book also says, a very personal project to you. What resonated with you in the process of researching and writing this, and did you find that experience sort of healing for yourself, or did it tear up old wounds for you? Did it have that personal a sort of connection to you?
I wouldn't say it turned up old wounds or was healing, because my experience was 33 years ago. What it was what really was for me, and in a number of occasions speaking to living people, I was in tears talking about it. So the lady I talked to, whose father went down on HMS Coventry when she was just a young girl, I think she was 13. Obviously, she's now, I don't want to give her age away, but it was 40, was it 50 years ago? 82. Oh, God, it must have been actually 50 years ago, 52 years ago. Talking to her about how the loss of her father still touches her today, how she still wonders where he is, wonders what might have been, would he have been a good grandfather? Would he, she talks about her own grandchildren now, and they talk about Granddad Mike, who has clearly been dead for 52 years. But they talk about him and that he's watching down, he's looking over them. And I find that really quite moving, bearing in mind that he's mentioned on a memorial, but they have nothing. The other one was, the other lady I spoke to that really touched me was Nikki Scott, whose husband was killed in Afghanistan. Now, her husband's body was returned, but she really helped me understand the reality of the grief, the process. And again, I don't know if you remember, Katya, but when in the height of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, the parades, the bodies returning to Wootton Bassett, the grand ceremony, they weren't there at first. They came back in secret almost. And then suddenly they became this huge ceremony. And her husband came back with, I think, 7 or 8 other bodies that were killed the same day. The biggest repatriation of bodies. And her talking about what it was like, the importance of seeing that ceremony, having our society acknowledge his sacrifice, her loss. That was really important. And what really struck me was that, Scotty was killed in an IED, a bomb blast. And she wanted to know everything about the loss of her husband. So she talked to the people who were with him. And obviously, if you're killed in a bomb blast, it can be quite unpleasant detail, but she wanted to know. And she tells me, and I say this in the book, she said, the one thing I regret. So she said she didn't, she was offered the chance of opening the coffin to see the remains, but everybody said you should not do it. And so she didn't. And she still thinks about that. She still thinks about that now. Should I have looked? And she said, sometimes I still wake up in the night and think, is he dead? Is he really gone? Or was he really in that coffin? And she'll phone one of his mates and say, you were with him? Are you sure he died? And in many ways, it sounds almost mad, but it's not. And then that adds real sense to the stories of the book, I say, where for sometimes 5, 10, 15 years after the First World War, people were going to the graveyards of France and digging up graves to try to find their son or their husband. They were digging up. One man, I think, launched 60 expeditions from Canada to disinter bodies to try to find his missing son. 60. Sometimes, I think the last one was something like 9 years after his son had been killed, 10 years. But then you can begin to understand it when you hear Nicky say, I still wonder. And we buried him, and I still wonder. And that's, for me, an amazing part of the story. And it's obviously, that's the emotion I want to try to bring in the book, obviously, that you read, and obviously in the theatre tour that I embark upon at the beginning of October. It's to try to bring that to life.
Yeah, and I think it is something that resonates with a lot of people, even those people who don't have, say, combat experience or have relatives in the military, because ultimately the same sorts of questions apply. When doctors call you and say that your grandfather died, do you want to go and see the body? And people ask themselves the same questions: do I want to see the body or not? Or so I think these are universal human experiences, I think, in a way, which I think is exactly why this topic resonates, and why I think even when you think that you can go on a theatre tour with this topic, because it resonates with that many people around the country, to talk about. I think that's amazing. Well, sadly, that's all we got time for today, John. I could have talked to you for much longer. There's so much detail in the book that is just mind-boggling, and I did really mean what I said in my endorsement. I did find that book a wonderful book, and stand by every word I said about it. I found it mind-churning in a good way, kind of literally make you think and keep you thinking long after the last page is turned. And so I highly recommend that to all of my listeners and readers as well. And obviously, even the little insight you've just given us into it will hopefully pique people's interest. So thank you so much for coming to give us a little preview on here on Zeitgeist.
Dankeschön, Katja. Auf Wiedersehen. Thank you.
Auf Wiedersehen und bis zum nächsten Mal bei Zeitgeist.
Danke.